We have been duped by feminism, sexual liberation, and antidepressants. We have been told that we are powerful and free now as women, but we feel tired, wired, and bitter. We're mostly eating right, exercising and meditating, wrangling to do lists, and arranging playdates. And yet there's a haunting hollowness beneath the huge complaints. What if I told you that there is a huge storehouse, a reservoir of energy inside of you that has not been tapped, that you could feel light and pulsing, excited and alive in ways that a wellness lifestyle cannot deliver, that you could trust yourself, that the world could feel safe, and that unexpected and expected delights could start to illuminate your path. No coach, therapist, doctor, or guru required. Just you learning to get real, present, and attentive with you. I feel like I'm here to matchmake your inner parts for the greatest love affair ever written. I want to help you learn first where you're buying eggs from the hardware store, which is the source of all pain. I want to help you master entering through the upset, which is the only spiritual practice you'll ever need, and to get real comfortable putting on your villain crown, which is, in my opinion, the key to true power. And then you'll attune to your inner yes so you can live the life defined by the specific pleasure of who you are. I am so excited to announce my latest book called The Reclaimed Woman, which is available for pre-order now. So if you head to the link in show notes, you can learn more about bonuses, events, and companion offerings. And I cannot wait to see your gorgeous face on the path. So I believe that in order to shift out of the perpetual struggle of victim consciousness and into your creator, creatrix, your claim on your birthright of vitality, you have to know what's possible. So if you're new to me or my work, or if you've been around for some time and just want a reminder of what's possible, I wanted to let you in on my history making protocol, Vital Mind Reset, which is a 44-day pattern disruptor for your narrative, for your life story. So Vital Mind Reset combines nutrition, detox, meditation, and self-empowerment for a truly holistic, like 360 signal of safety to be sent to your mind and body. So whether you want to get off of prescription meds and heal chronic illness, move through stress, so-called anxiety and depression, or just feel your absolute best for the rest of your life, this is the path that I have walked myself and that I have helped thousands walk since. So I think the story of this resetter, as we like to call the graduates of the program, is going to resonate with you or with someone you love if you've been struggling with the effects of prescription medication. So here's Gloria's story in her own words. My story is like many of us, a concoction of drugs for 20 years and depressive episodes that were getting worse and closer together. I was at the brink of complete desperation when I found Dr. Brogan's book last year. It gave me the confidence to start managing my tapering. Thank you, Dr. Brogan. She says the process took 12 months, but as of the 7th of April this year, I am completely drug-free. I could burst into tears as I write that publicly. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I could do it. I was brought up believing that I was damaged goods, and if I stopped taking a pill, my world would completely crumble. I haven't crumbled. I've grown. I've tapped into a strength that was within me all along. I just lost touch with it. Have I got a long way to go? Yeah, I do, but I'm getting there slowly, and the commitment to VMR is another step. I really resonate with this resetter story personally because so many of us cling to the victim stories and narratives that we were brought up with. But Gloria reclaimed her health through the protocol and the procedures and the techniques that Vital Mind Reset establishes in your lifestyle, in your self-care, and it affords the reclamation of choice. I love celebrating outcomes like these because it is so important to take in progress, acknowledge it, honor it, and allow it to become your guiding light. So if you know you're ready to reclaim your health and to come home to yourself with my support from my lead coach, Jamie, and a beautiful community of like-minded, like-hearted, dedicated humans walking this reclamation path with you, I would love to invite you to join our live Vital Mind Reset program that begins at the end of March. and calling all practitioners and health coaches. Resolve your imposter syndrome once and for all. Legitimize your capacity to set the foundation for evidence based lifestyle change and become licensed to offer Vital Mind Reset to your clients as a part of your suite of tools. It all starts March 25th. Check out the link in show notes, and I will see you in there. I'm Dr. Kelly Brogan. You may know me as a New York Times bestselling author of a book with an exploding pill on the cover, renegade psychiatrist, pole dancer, or honorary member of the Disinformation Dozen. What can I say? I'm a born provocateur. I've spent most of my recent life exposing deceptions, connecting dots, and discovering the secret places my inner victim is still waiting to be liberated. And now I feel called to help you reclaim all of your parts, your health, your sexuality, your power, and your expression, so that you can finally truly own yourself. I want to ignite in you that inner knowing and the pulsing vitality that lives beneath your disempowerment, disconnection, and resentment, so that you can audaciously, courageously, and playfully alchemize your struggle into the specific pleasure of who you are. This is Reclamation Radio, a Soulfire production. Hi, and welcome back to Reclamation Radio. I am Dr. Kelly Brogan, and today I would like to talk science, and specifically the published medical literature that makes very clear that chronic illness is something that you can walk away from. And so are multiple medications associated with that illness and a sick identity. So I, about 10 years ago, had a 2-year wait list in my private practice in Manhattan because I had become known for my capacity to facilitate deprescribing or the discontinuation of psychiatric meds and others, including, birth control and acid blockers and statins, et cetera, that women were taking sometimes for upwards of 2 decades and often multiple medications. What I was up to was not any sort of brain surgery, right? So it was a basic protocol that I would implement with my signature energy and my vision that I had for these women. That it was always came very natively to me to be able to see these women in their full grandeur somehow, even as they were sometimes, one phone call away from state hospital and, seriously symptomatic and very much teetering on the edge of hope. So I don't know why I have that capacity. However, it has served to expand the permission field of those who often find themselves in front of me. And you probably know that I'm a huge believer in the concept of permission field. So once we know that something is possible, we have permission to see ourselves in a different framework and one that is no longer predicated on a deep brokenness, wrongness, and like random consciousness that otherwise is almost inevitable when we are diagnosed and potentially even hexed by a new experience of symptoms as we encounter the allopathic system. So when I started Vital Mind Reset, it was designed as a companion to my New York Times bestselling book. Somehow it was a New York Times bestseller, even though it's totally blacklisted on every single mainstream media outlet. It was designed as a companion for that book. And very quickly, we began to see outcomes through Vital Mind Reset that surpassed what I was seeing in my private practice, where my, consultation fees were literally an order of magnitude more. And you had to physically come to New York and all the things. So I have some psychospiritual explanations for why we might choose to remain a patient, even in the care of a doctor who is intending to render you no longer a patient and, sort of mommy daddy projections and that kind of a thing. But suffice it to say that the community field of VMR was and is a more powerful crucible than the dyad of the one-on-one that I experienced in my practice. The outcomes that we began to see were, in some cases, ones that I literally couldn't find matched in the medical literature. I also had the opportunity to work with my mentor, Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, who was churning out outcomes in his field of terminal cancer and neurodegenerative illnesses for 27 years. So, this field of possibility that grew through Vital Mind Reset seemed like something I wanted documented, almost like, I don't know, I guess I had a little bit of like a mischievous energy wanting it to appear in black and white in the medical literature. So I manifested a team of extraordinary volunteers and we set to transcribing many of these cases. And I was able to publish them in peer reviewed, indexed journals. And so I will be sharing with you some of the high level summary, perhaps just so that you can hear and it can rattle around your awareness that these kinds of outcomes are yours to claim. I'm just going to take you through the high level aspects of these papers. Okay, so this one is called Resolution of Refractory Bipolar Disorder with Psychotic Features and Suicidality Through Lifestyle Interventions, and it is a case report. This is, many of you may know, Ali Zek, and she has gone public with the publication of this paper, which is obviously the only reason I'm sharing that. So she had eating disorder diagnosis. Many of my patients came to me with eating disorder NOS, as it's called, not otherwise specified, or specifically restrictive eating disorder, also known as anorexia nervosa or bulimia. She developed this face picking psychosis where she had this sensation that something was literally in her face that she was removing. And, you know, now if you follow her journey, the plot has has thickened around, the role of breast implants in that as far as she is unpacking. However, what applies to this paper is that before her period, every month she developed psychotic symptoms. She was prescribed Xanax and then in withdrawal related to Xanax was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So there's a lot of, fabrication of the bipolar disorder diagnosis around iatrogenic effects of other medications, either withdrawal or intoxication effects like with antidepressants. So, and I'll reference this probably several times, but a Yale study from some years ago demonstrated that 1 in 23 people who are prescribed an antidepressant go on to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And of course, I was taught in my training, as perhaps you were, that the antidepressant is just unmasking that, right? Or the Xanax discontinuation is just unmasking it. It was already there. Well, I'm not so sure about that. So she had self tapered her medications before coming to my office and was considering state hospitalization. She did the protocol, in a very disciplined fashion. And by her second menstrual cycle of our working together, she had resolution of her psychotic symptoms and agitation. She was one of the examples of a patient who was doing twice daily enemas for hormonal support. Sometimes that can be, if it's clear that there's a hormonal diathesis, that can be helpful. And this report is 10 months after, the protocol where she was stable and without medication. And now at the time of this recording that I'm making today, it's been 8 years and she's medication, doctor, and diagnosis free. Okay. This one is called Healing of Graves' Disease Through Lifestyle Changes, a case report. So, this one, to my knowledge, is the first report in the medical literature of a so called natural healing of Graves' disease. So, Graves' disease that is healed without radiotherapy, without surgery, without medication. On paper, the antibodies resolve, the TSH, and the hormones are normalized. So, this is in a 34-year-old woman who did the protocol. This next one is pretty profound. This is schizophrenia, symptom alleviation through implementation of a lifestyle intervention protocol. And in this case, we have a 22-year-old male who was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, who was experiencing suicidal ideation, was diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 17 and multiply medicated, including Clozaril. And he experienced behavioral change within 19 days of the protocol. So The primary manifestation was in his socialization and his capacity to request to leave the house. So he was homebound. Actually, the full extent of this case is that his mother was actually considering euthanasia for him, with him, because of how recidivistic his symptoms were and how at the end of their rope they were, I guess. And he started to ask to leave the house and then began volunteering locally. And he was actually diagnosed by his providers to have been in remission at the time of this publication, where he continued to taper his medications for the ensuing years since we have been in touch. Okay. This next one is successful discontinuation of chronic polypsychotropic regimen and resolution of withdrawal syndrome through nutrition and lifestyle interventions. So, this individual is a 38-year-old woman who was diagnosed multiply. So, with generalized anxiety, major depression, anorexia, and post traumatic stress. And she wanted to taper her multiple medications in anticipation of pregnancy. So the taper involved Klonopin, Restoril, Effexor, Lamictal. In this case, it was interesting because this was one of my early cases where before, so I was specialized in reproductive psychiatry, so I worked a lot with this population. And before I implemented VMR as a requirement for medication taper, we had a failed taper. So she failed to successfully taper these medications and was so medically destabilized that the contrast was really notable because once we implemented the protocol, not only was it not necessarily a walk in the park, but not only was it successful, but I continue to hear from this patient to this day, some 15 years later, and included some elements of her commentary in my last book in the section on psychedelics, actually. And she has gone on to have just such an extraordinary and inspirational journey because she came from a very, very, very severe sexual abuse history. Most of the cases of complex prescribing, are in those settings. Okay. A huge part of my journey into my body has been developing a relationship with nature. This is also why I moved to Miami in 2018 from the cold, hard streets of New York City, and why that was one of the greatest gifts I have ever given myself in this lifetime. I also know that there are women who are more in tune, more aligned with the natural world than I am. I like to be around these women. I like to learn from these women. And I certainly like to know what products they are creating. So, my friend, Katie Hess of Lotus Way, is one of those women. She's basically a flower witch. And I have been so blessed to enjoy her products over the years, many years actually at this point. Flower remedies are the most powerful transformational agent that we've seen, and they are safe and gentle for everyone, even pregnant mamas and little ones, and they confer alignment to your system in profound ways. I'm super excited to share Lotus Way with you. And the way that you can begin your journey with their products is that you simply choose the flower that you are visually attracted to. And that is exactly what you need to support yourself. So head over to lotusway.com and use the code Kelly15 for 15% off so that you can begin your journey home to yourself. The link is in show notes for you. So, the next is healing of dissociative identity disorder, borderline personality traits, and bipolar disorder through lifestyle interventions, a case report. So, this is a 40-year-old woman who also has a history of sexual abuse. She was 16 years old when she began medications, and which is very typical of a lot of the patients that will clients, not sure what to refer them to, participants that we will work with, is that they began medications very early in life and then they were sort of like layered on. So she actually, believe it or not, was treated with 30 rounds of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, for postpartum suicidality. She had multiple hospitalizations. And through the protocol, she resolved both physical and psychiatric symptoms, including fatigue, acne, migraines, cold sweats, dizziness, nausea, blood sugar instability. She had resting tremors. She had brain fog, what she described as anxiety and depression. So, this participant also lost 30 pounds through the program. And interestingly, when she was exposed to gluten, incidentally, sort of like in an unanticipated way, but she was able to track her response, she noted mood lability, brain fog, and irrational thoughts like come back online. And this is what, and then I'll say, and she completed her final medication taper with Lamictal and Buspar over the ensuing 2 years. So she had this stabilization during the program and some remarkable so-called psychiatric and physical results. And then she went on to complete her taper, which is, of course, the order of operations I believe in. And I was going to mention also in the schizophrenia case and also the Graves case that I do believe I also have other unpublished cases, including lupus, 18-year lupus patient, that some of these very, very dramatic cases of resolution within weeks of symptoms, especially physical symptoms, I do believe is related to gluten antigenicity and intolerance. I can't explain why that is so remarkable in some people and not in others, but I do know that the very, very strict boundaries around gluten and the homologous proteins in dairy in this setting, it seems to work some miracles. And then there are many, individuals who are already on a gluten-free diet who go on to have, success through the protocol. And obviously it was not related to that. So there are other factors that are at play. But I do think that in these very radical cases, I do think that's an aspect of it. Okay. So this one is a VMR case, remote healing of bipolar disorder, eating disorder not otherwise specified, post traumatic stress disorder, fibromyalgia, and irritable bowel syndrome through lifestyle change. So this individual had an extreme, very severe, not that anything isn't severe and extreme, sexual abuse history, including child trafficking. She actually did the program on food stamps. So that was notable, that she was able to corral that level of motivation and organization to she was motivated by my book, A Mind of Your Own. And she did the program on very minimal resources. She had a history of depression diagnosis, alcohol abuse, bipolar disorder, disordered eating, fibromyalgia, PTSD. She was on a collection of 15 medications, had a history of multiple hospitalizations and significant suicide attempts. And at the time of this publication, she was 1 year asymptomatic and actually had a report of her bipolar disorder diagnosis being deleted from her clinical record by her prescriber. Next is clinical remission of treatment resistant depression, polysubstance abuse, and antidepressant discontinuation syndrome, as it's called in the literature. This is withdrawal through engagement of lifestyle interventions. So, this is a 50-year-old woman. She had 25 years of exposure to multiple medications, which began after she was started on antibiotics as a 19-year-old. And then in her 20s, she had rounds of antibiotics and she developed depressive symptoms, was medicated, hospitalized, suicide attempts, then experienced withdrawal when she attempted to discontinue an SNRI, antidepressant, and stimulants, and a benzo. So she attempted to taper these and experienced what she describes as a feeling of being electrocuted. This is very common. Burning in her GI tract, bloating, a lot of like fear, vigilance, volatile moods, and minimal exercise tolerance. So that's, sort of this autonomic instability. And her menstrual cycle also abruptly stopped during this medication discontinuation window. So we were able to bring her to stability through the protocol. She was somebody who was very impacted and benefited greatly from the Kundalini aspects of the program. And we got a 3-year follow up from her where she wrote, I like my life. So I'm not sure it gets better than that. Okay. So this is a case series that we published. It's called Psychotropic Drug Withdrawal and Holistic Tapering Strategies, a case series. And essentially, there are two groups in this series comparing medication taper processes to another cohort of individuals who were struggling with protracted withdrawal, who, came off their meds on their own in some other way and were still unstable, months, sometimes years later. Also, in this category, we put people who were dealing with ultimately what was uncovered as the psychiatric pretenders. So maybe you've heard me talk about those, but essentially, these are physiologic imbalances that often drive psychiatric diagnoses. So things like blood sugar instability, gluten, dairy, or other food intolerances, micronutrient deficiencies, things like, B12 after decades of vegetarianism, for example, medication side effects. So, as I mentioned, this is a big one where you have the NuvaRing, or you're taking birth control, or you've just started on an acid blocker or a statin vaccine or antibiotic, and you develop, manic or depressive symptoms or suicidality out of nowhere, or thyroid, right? So obviously I learned a lot about that through my own experience with Hashimoto's thyroiditis and the way that hypothyroidism symptoms line up pretty much line for line with major depressive symptoms. And then the postpartum window, the thyroiditis that occurs postpartum, the way that it can overlap with postpartum psychosis and depression. And the sort of timing of it is also very notable. So, in the first group, there were 8 patients who had exposure to various medications: Wellbutrin, Prozac, Ativan, Klonopin, Zoloft, Celexa, Cymbalta. And some of them had had failed tapers in the past, and they were all successfully tapered through the protocol. In the second group, there were 4 patients, and this also includes a thyroid case. So, that seemed like she had some psychiatric issues, had protracted ongoing symptoms, and turned out that that's what was going on. And the protocol was helpful in that regard. So there are also a number of references in this particular paper at the end, if you're interested, for, things like the gut brain axis and gluten, nutrition, and even enemas. Okay. So the crown jewel is this is an IRB approved, amazingly. Rob Abbott is the reason that happened. And he worked some serious magic and is such an amazing collaborator, as were all of these authors. And this is an IRB approved randomized trial of VMR. And there were 71 subjects between the ages of 20 and 64. And they all had a pre-existing major depressive disorder diagnosis. And 60% of them had 3 or more diagnoses. Okay. So these are, the walking wounded, in many ways, because that sounds like, oh, they must have been really sick people. And obviously, in some cases of these reports we've just gone over, these would be considered, severely mentally ill individuals, and certainly, women who have struggled greatly in their lives. However, it is very easy to accumulate 3 psychiatric diagnoses. And, this can happen over the course of your 20s. If you've had a bad breakup in college, you can find yourself with, 3 or more diagnoses and be somebody who might be in a position to do an online protocol and program. So, all that is to say, these are, I think, a very representative sample. So 60% had 3 or more diagnoses, and roughly 66% were taking 1 or more medications. So 37 of them did VMR, and 34 were on the wait list. So that the wait list was the control. So they just were waiting, so that's a pretty common control method in these trials. So 26 completed the protocol, and that included these specific clinical measurements. Because remember, in psychiatry, this is how we do things. It's like quizzes, essentially. So the PHQ-9, the SF-36, and the MSQ. And there were 26 folks who completed those. These are men and women. And then there were 27 ultimately on the wait list. And what we found was that there was statistical improvement, so statistically significant improvement in mental health and vitality. So, believe it or not, those are actually like the terms vitality. I thought that was on the nose. So, from these assessments, and that the mean scores suggested a statistical improvement in the total symptom burden. So essentially, all of this is to say that the protocol was validated as efficacious for its intended outcome, which was mental health, and there was a side bonus of vitality. So that was a very exciting moment in the history of this protocol because, to my knowledge, other than the Bredesen protocol, which is for an entirely different, intention, population outcome in the dementia world, this is the only one that I know of that has this level of published literature. This last paper I thought to share with you all, not because it's related to, VMR per se, but because it's one of the reasons why VMR might be a good idea, especially if somebody is on medications, recently started on medications, or withdrawing from medications, because we know based on Lucier and Crotty's report from a decade ago that certain folks are at risk. So run of the mill folks, your uncle, your therapist, your neighbor, at risk for impulsive violence towards self and others when they are started on these medications. And I have shared some of the whistleblowers in this realm who have experienced very personally some like unspeakable losses. And this is a report that I was, honored to support, and it's called Treatment Emergent Violence to Self and Others, a literature review of neuropsychiatric adverse reactions for antidepressant and neuroleptic psychiatric drugs and general medications. It's quite thorough and lengthy. And essentially what it looks at is the pharmacogenetics, and we're just going to make a lot of assumptions about the validity of these research methodologies that, that genes are what we think they are, and that we actually have ever identified a receptor. And, when I spend enough time around my colleagues, I question to that level. However, for the purposes of our discussion, it's about the pharmacogenetics of akathisia and violence in the setting of both treatment and treatment withdrawal. So, in case this is interesting, it is published. And all of these papers are published in the peer-reviewed literature. You can find these papers and many, many more testimonials on our website at kellybroganmd.com/outcomes. And I hope that this serves to remind you that your illness is a question only you can answer. And often the first step in that journey is the reclamation of the power of your choice and the restoration of the locus of control within you, sending this signal of safety so that you can begin to regenerate, reclaim, and restore your vital force energy, and to make sense out of why it is that you are expressing the symptoms, that you were experiencing the struggle with your health that you were. This has been done. This path has been well trodden by thousands I have had the deep honor of bearing witness to, and something that I've experienced in my own process and journey home to self. All right, until next time.